Perfect. Okay. So we touched on the housekeeping item around our intent to use the session specifically on the governance topics you see below. I wanted to give an update that the questions that were submitted from our community review of the interoperability roadmap governance chart have been submitted. They went through the contact us standards channel. I was a little delayed. I put them in last week, but they did go through, and I had some just follow up saying that it's been assigned to an Info 8 team member that will essentially just go through the requests and start addressing our questions. So there is kind of a tie-in on our agenda this meeting that should go really quickly, but it's around another type of request that we discussed on our 2 governance calls ago. So I guess that would have been 3 weeks ago. I know following our review of that interoperability governance chart, we had been discussing some of the challenges and how our content should be updated in the CA baseline relevant to our use of or our identification of the Canadian URI registry. So there's some messaging that I want us to review to make sure it's all kosher and it's ready to be submitted through the same channels. The other components of that, I think there is some kind of finalization to confirm whether or not we do need to change how we are referencing the Canadian URI registry for practitioner and patient pages. We had left it off to say about 3 weeks ago, we showed folks, this is the current places it's called out. In some places, the guidance is a little bit more detailed than others, and that we will need to make a decision about whether or not we scale back or change our written content to better kind of scale to utilizing an artifact that updates kind of on its own as an external artifact. And then the last piece I'm most excited about today, which is returning to our conversation around our guidance that we want to be able to express on our guidelines for use page. We have been working through what content and what types of recommendations that we want to ensure are present within the guide to support a future ballot. And we had started to review some of the decisioning, and what would that have been, about maybe 5 weeks ago? And there are some components that I want to chat with the group today to talk through whether or not we do want to provide guidance on certain mechanisms that are new and emerging in FHIR that we can discuss and just have a mull on before we make a final decision about how we express those in the guidelines for use. Okay. Anything else on this agenda that other folks would like to see or would highlight for prioritization? All right. So on the first front, we should be relatively simple. So basically, I took for the...
Okay, you jumped over housekeeping.
No, I think that was what we covered in the beginning, which is next governance call, attendance likely limited. We were using this call instead to cover governance content.
Okay, because I'm going to say I'm still in HL7 meetings next week, so okay.
Yeah, so unless we hear otherwise, we would be canceling the governance call on the 15th. Hearing not otherwise, I think, Mike, are we good to log that as a decision? When we will resume with profiling on the 22nd. I can do that.
Sounds good. I'll cancel the stuff on the forum, and I can make an agenda post as well. Or not an agenda post, you know what I mean, a forum post to let people know.
Okay,
perfect. Thank you.
Great.
All right. Okay, so the second topic, which is essentially just validating we're comfortable with this messaging that conveys the pain point that was raised 2 sessions ago on the governance call, particularly around trying to convey we are an end user of the naming systems in the CA URI registry, that through kind of our channels, users have expressed concerns around maintenance processes and kind of a lack of clear documented maintenance practices and its impact on our content, particularly from the lens of the CA baseline, that provides in the request a little bit of context behind how we utilize this, though important to note, and I think we've discussed this ad nauseum, we aren't the governor of practices surrounding this asset, but we do have members that are experiencing this, and we are an impacted end user in itself. So We highlighted some of the discussion points for like decisions that we had heard might be necessary. But again, these are just examples. We aren't putting them forward as from a CA baseline perspective, but likely these are kinds of things that would help for us as an end user to have as a decision point as well. So this is the formal request. We'll provide the full pain point context and request through that contact us forum. And this just provides a little bit of kind of tie back into the fact that, you know, we understand as reviewers of an alternative artifact that right now interoperability governance is kind of being evolved, and that we thought this particular request could be well solved through development under those structures or development of new structures through that process. Is there any content here that folks are uncomfortable with or that you feel should be worded differently before it is submitted to InfoA through the contact us form? Does anyone still need time to read before further answering that question? All right, I will take that as no concerns with the current wording. No one needs more time to read through it to make a informed decision.
Sorry,
Oh,
just
go ahead.
one question. Sorry for that. Just a little slow, brain here. Just from technical perspective, and if we would talk about the definition about the URI, actually does cover the URN, which is OID being categorized in. That's my understanding. So when we talk about the CA URI registry, CA OID registry, we can see that a manner just may need some little bit of fine print to provide some definition or description why we do it in that manner. Because when we talk about the CA URI registry, from certain point, it should cover CA OID registry.
Yes. As a case in point, we have an OID request has come through to the implementers group from Nova Scotia for review, which doesn't have a FHIR URI in it. And where's our position on that? I don't know what it is.
So can I capture that as both the definitions for the registries themselves, their relationships, and how to handle requests that go through one but not the other?
Well, right now the requests for both are supposed to come to this group, the FHIR implementers call forum.
FHIR implementers call, yep.
Yeah.
Which is quarterly, yep.
So
yeah,
and the review procedures are supposed to be the same.
Honestly, and my understanding about the URI and the OID, which is as a representative of URN, yes, we could start from FHIR perspective, but they are not only being scoped within FHIR.
Correct.
It can be
both.
Yeah,
right?
it can be. I mean, not OID, but URI as well. URI, this concept comes from the World Wide Web, which is called distributed hypermedia system, and it comes there from there as it is with very living knowledge being adopted by the FHIR, and it could be utilized in the V2, V3 as well. But yes, I know that from the V2, V3, the original structure they prefer use, or they mostly use OID, but it doesn't stop ban to use the URL in the V2 and V3. It just hasn't been utilized in the manner that in popular way before, because OID, as my understanding, the very limit knowledge about V3, just beyond scope of that, is only be treated as a string or a text string. In that manner, URL can chip in as alternative of a URN in V2, V3 without a significant impact. So when we talk about a CA-URI registry or CA-OID registry here, my understanding, CA-OID registry comes first, this history there. So with that history, we would like to bring in CA-URI registry on top of it, or maybe borrow some experience from the OID registry, but
Well,
they should be
and we've
treated.
linked them, but the URIs generally aren't used in V2 or V3.
Can I just get ahead a little bit of this conversation, which is, I don't want to jump into what should be our guidance of
Yes.
do we do both. Like, I want to avoid that because I think what we're clearly trying to say here is that these are outstanding definition or outstanding questions that should have formal decisions, formal documentation made out of them, and formal time
Yes.
to actually discuss them. So
Yeah, I would agree, Sharon, sorry.
am I okay with how I've phrased this? So it's not just the definitions for the registries themselves and the relationships, but also guidance on the use of both URI OID and how to handle requests that go through one and not the other. Does that define, like, is that capture?
Yeah.
kind of-
So,
Okay.
so it's not quite right, because how to handle requests that go through one and not the other. Right now, our request system is the same for both.
And it should be.
And yes, Randy, I think that was Randy.
Yes.
I agree that it should be. But we need to make sure we handle requests for new registrations and or updates or maintenance for those.
Yeah, we just should make sure that, well, when they come through to review this in whatever manner they're going, that the concept should be that OIDs and URIs are treated the same. And they do
Yeah, they
exactly
need to
the
be
same
linked.
things.
Yeah, they need to be
Yeah.
linked because we need to
Was-
handle them in both systems.
So is that a better reflection? Or new registrations, because it's really just what's our process for handling those requests?
Yes,
Well, maybe it's to ensure that they're linked together, the OID and the URI.
So I would say, Randy, that is a decision that probably should be formalized through this, rather than
Yeah,
us.
well, yeah,
making that
I agree.
initiative. Yeah.
I mean, and it's how we've behaved in the past that they are linked. But yes, it should be formalized. I agree.
So with that
So-
update,
So one
our-
of the questions is, when we get, like, there's an OID request that came out to the Fire Implementers Forum for a new OID, which didn't include a URI. Do we require that they include a URI that's linked to the OID or not? So we can't solve that here, but that's one of the things that needs to be formalized.
and probably something as community members that have opinions, you can offer some of the reasoning behind why they should also include that. In
Yeah.
the meantime, like, without the formal governance, you can still probably work with your peers on what's worked with you in the past.
Well, we actually had a formal governance definition for how we requested new OIDs.
Yep, that's probably something also then, if you've got the formalized documentation on that particular topic that could be shared from a peer.
Well,
Oh.
the documentation that we have on the site right now was created with the intent of covering both at the same time.
It was, and it changed
It just may not
recently.
have the text to say that, but that's the way it was
Yeah.
Well,
created.
it actually did have the text to cover both for a while, and then it got changed.
Yeah,
in
that
the
was a
last
mistake,
month.
yeah. Like
So
I
that's-
noticed that there's now 2 separate postings on the InfoWay tools, one for URI, one for OID. We really should have only a single link that says OID and URI request.
Okay, that's
That was the
still
intent.
another change. So there's
That-
stuff that's been shifting around that space lately.
So Randy, are you comfortable just reaching out with, as a peer, just to indicate that they should be putting the requests through both? And then we can confirm whether or not we should be submitting this.
I'm not sure who I'd make that to.
I meant to the requester from Nova Scotia, if the
Okay.
concern is that they aren't operating as desired by the folks on this call.
No, I have to go look and see, because like, due to the nice little thing not forwarding us the messages, I haven't seen it yet, so.
Because I wasn't getting the forum messages, I didn't see it until I went to look on the forum for your piece about the bird of a feather.
So, Lorraine, maybe if you're on the forum now, you can put that in the chat and we can come to a conclusion on this particular action item. Does that work?
I'm not sure what I would put in the chat.
The link to the post from the Nova Scotia OID request. If not, these are just suggestions that I'm making as a community member. How you guys handle it is totally up to you. But ultimately, I think we do need to stay on topic for this meeting, which is to, rather than solve for these, make sure that we're submitting the request for the structure that will solve for these.
Yes, and the changes you made to the context, I think, are appropriate.
Okay. Anyone feel uncomfortable with what's here today? An addition, a change, for what's needed before this gets submitted to the contact us page? All right, I will submit that following our call. The next item, and I will not jinx it now by saying I think it should be quick, but I want to make sure folks are comfortable with, and we have a chance together to look at exactly how we call out our identifier guidance on the pages that relate to the use of naming systems. I did some prep work ahead of time and confirmed that the language that is on the practitioner and the practitioner role, those profiles for general and provider registry, so it's copy and pasted from both. So we don't have to open up a total of, what would that be, 5? Because practitioner role in both lenses and all 4 pages is the same. But I do want to make sure we take a look at patient, and I do want to make sure we look at one of the practitioner or practitioner role examples so we can confidently say a change is needed or a change is not needed. So I've got those pulled up here. All right, so for folks that are following along, I'm posting this into the chat so you can see the 2 pages that I'm going to look at here. The patient page that I'm going to pull up first is going to be the one that has probably significantly more information within it that describes potentially naming systems that are in the registry. The reason I'm raising that is because I think anytime we talk about positioning a code system or a naming system and calling it out in a guide that does not control it, if we feel that these URIs could change in the future, we should be considering whether or not we need to make a modification to future-proof it. So rather than, calling out, for instance, these, if we felt like there was concern, we could say, readers are suggested to review the URIs with this identifier type in the registry without claiming them. But
the whole point about a naming system is the naming system doesn't change. The URI that gets buried within the naming system could change, but the naming system is consistent. That's one of the problems that the naming system is designed to address. So I don't think we should be that worried about the naming system itself changing.
And so on that note, if we only claim the naming system here, and we don't speak about the URI that's assigned to it, does that mean our content does not have to get updated?
Well, no, there's a URI to the naming system that's what the naming system is, right? If you look inside the naming system, it has the URI, it has potentially the OID. A lot of ours have OIDs, and sometimes they have alternate URIs within the naming system, right? But the naming system itself, that URI, is what's supposed to be consistent. That's the whole point of the naming system resource.
Right. It's just like with an OID, once you have that value, it's not supposed to be changing.
Yeah. I mean, you might change the description, you might change where it points to, you might change a whole lot of things underneath
The
it.
URI
But
itself should be constant.
yeah, it's sort of like the resource ID is immutable. The naming system should be immutable.
So
now we have maintenance to do on some of those naming systems potentially,
Mhm.
but the naming system itself should be consistent.
So is there anything on this page, asked a different way, that we would be concerned with it existing in an external artifact that we should consider removing or generalizing or changing in some way?
Sorry, just a little bit confused here. Sorry for that. I just, maybe take too much time here. Just based on the screen, on my screen here, I have some kind of a little bit opinion about naming system here. Actually, I put it down a little bit to the namespace here. If we go to the system, use it. Can I just stay here? That's okay.
Oh,
Just-
stay, not, don't
yeah,
scroll
just
down.
stay.
Okay.
Yeah, just stay here. If we use this one as example, type coding system here, the value of a system, my understanding, is the namespace, which the code is an identifier within that namespace. And also when we combine these two parts together, it could be a URI for the specific resource being identified and the type coding here. That's my understanding, the relation between the URI and the identifier and the here called a name system, namespace. Naming system may have some little bit of extra component on top of a namespace, but my understanding system should include a namespace with that, my understanding. Just want
Yeah,
to clarify.
my understanding of naming system is it's basically conceptually, and this isn't a fire term. It's conceptually the identifier type that provides you the name space to resolve what the identifier is. Outside of this conversation, we do have some questions because about how we've registered the JHNs and things, because we're getting in the BC client registry, we have information sources, for instance, from Alberta for both JHN and ULEZ. And I'm actually not sure that anybody ever sends ULEZ out of province. But so there's some detailed questions on maintenance and descriptions. But then to me, the naming system is the identifier we use to determine what identifier type we're talking about. And then there's a whole bunch of other details in terms of descriptions and aliases and synonyms and other things that go on below that. But the naming system is the consistent way we define what that is.
There's at least one thing I might have a little bit different opinion regarding the resolvability, or could they call it for the URN called a resolution capability, actually cannot be guaranteed by the URI. If we treat it here, my understanding, system combined with the code here, treated as to compose called absolute, if it's possible, absolute URI here. It can go that manner, treated coded URI, but there's no any guarantee that this URI can be resolvable. And that's my understanding. Is it
true,
just
Thomas.
sorry, that's
true.
identification only.
Yes, that's true, but it's really, it's no different than an OID. It's a string that identifies what this namespace is. Ideally, it's resolvable, but it doesn't have to be.
Right, there's no requirement that they're resolvable.
List from just very limited knowledge about the difference between the URL, here's HTTP scheme-based URL, and with the URN, which is we talk about a URL, sorry, as example, with the definition there, the URN is more persistent and is locator independent.
Yeah,
And
we're
the
talking about URIs, not
Right.
URLs.
yeah, but here is a URL actually.
No,
and
it's a URI.
Well, we talk about a
It
URL.
looks like a URL, but it's a URI.
Sorry for that. Actually, my understanding here, based on my understanding about the definition from the RFC document, this is called URL and the URI. URI is umbrella terminology. And URI, there's two categories. One is called URN. OID is one of the example there. Another one is called URL, which is locator. HTTP scheme has been registered in IANA as one of the URL scheme. Here they have HTTP colon here. Based on my understanding for the definition, this is URL, not URL.
No, it's not.
Unfortunately, I have different opinion here, but I just stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. That's
it's
why we
most
call it the
definitely
Canadian
URIs.
the Canadian URI registry.
Yeah,
Now,
URIs are not the same.
go ahead. Ideally, it's nice if they're resolvable, but that's not a requirement of the URI registry or
Exactly.
the naming system. So what we're talking about really here, just like we had OIDs before, where OIDs identified an identifier system space. And they were, once we sort of assigned them, you weren't supposed to interpret the contents. They were just strings that said, this is what they were. That's not any different from what we have for naming systems now. It's a string that identifies this is a type of identifier. We'd like them to be resolvable, but they don't have to be. And they can be related to, and they can be then related to descriptions and the OIDs that match to them and a whole bunch of other things. And if the underlying system changes, you can change the underlying system and update it, keep the naming system the same. It's an identifier for a concept. And I think that I'm just looking in detail what we have here. Of course, our descriptions for each of the different jurisdictional health numbers aren't currently consistent, but that's just a maintenance issue.
Put that in. So action would be ensuring that the descriptions match up to what is currently in.
Yeah,
the
because
name.
I think the Alberta one talks about ULIs versus JHNs and things.
It should talk about ULIs because that's what we're using. We don't have a JHN specifically.
Yeah, I understand that, but some of our provincial partners don't understand that.
Yeah, we need the ULI text in there to make sure people can understand the
Mhm.
concept. So
Yeah, so
where
it's
are you
moving to-
seeing that, Lorraine, exactly?
Oh, if you go and look in the description around the Alberta
let's
URI.
go to Alberta one and you'll see it.
Wait, but so you're talking about here?
But go to that link.
Okay, but that link isn't maintained in this guide. So we're not talking, we're talking about like, the things in this guide that need to be updated.
Yeah, I actually think what's in terms of the guide, this is all fine. You know, the whole discussion about ULIs versus JHNs is outside of this group conversation.
Got it, okay. Well, I do want to offer it to other people as well, which is like, so Lorraine, preliminary scan of what you're seeing here, you're not seeing any concerns with the content as it's written. Are other folks seeing concerns with our, like what we put down for the, the actual URIs, the use of the URI registry, or any of the content here that we think would be
Yeah,
not featured?
so we see the full list of identifiers can be found on the URI registry, and I think that's appropriate. I just think we have some maintenance issues. So I think this is actually all right myself. I'll pause for other people's opinions.
Last wording, and my understanding, we really need to bring in, not maybe in this conversation, maybe go to InfoWay channel, really bring in some other experts about URI to review this process. My understanding, yes, there's no any major issues here, but what I observed is actually the OID short description code being utilized here that doesn't mean it's wrong, and also the naming space. I don't know why to be given in this manner for the registry, because for each PT they might have their own base URI, which is a chip in to go through that algorithm to concatenate with the partial URI to build their own absolute URI, or even go to the target URI down the road. And that's a very complicated process, but here make it simple. I don't know what's the rationale why we provide this for each PT. We have this registry naming system here, but I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Well, what I can say is if we go up to patient, you can see the extent in which we actually reference this content. So if we go to identifiers and we go to our slices, I think our reasoning for including it to begin with was we do have an identifier that specifically says, here is how the pattern for identifying a jurisdictional health number. It should definitely have a type that's JHN that comes from the system, but the system itself that populates this would be expected to be, and this again, this is written language. This is not a fire constraint guidance to have it come from the URI registry. So really the way I link this and I see this is, okay, you've got a comment here. Help me understand, how do I get there? Help me understand what goes there. Help me understand what I might see. But we don't go into further details. I was looking at this actually just very briefly. This is the part where I thought, well, maybe there's some things here that might be more tapping into the whole guidance piece, but largely it's communicative.
Well, and the reason we ended up in the conversation locally about it was because the profiles that the registry team had written referenced the Canadian baseline, and so they based on inheriting from the baseline, we referenced these URIs or these naming systems, and there were some differences in what was put into the BC Core, and we're trying to resolve it because one of the project teams was saying, well, should we be following the Canadian baseline or following something else? So I think it's appropriate what you've done here.
So I'll make that call one more time, which is there anything here that needs to, and suggestions of what should be directly added, edited, or removed?
Hi,
Looks good
Sharon.
to me.
I heard two there.
Yeah, it's Kenya. So I see that there is PPN and JHN. So those are both part of the base fire identifier types. JPIT is not, which is fine because it's extensible. But should we make a note that you should just use JPID on its own, and you're not required to pass through any other identifier type from the base types that are defined in base fire?
Indicating under the JPID to
Yeah.
pass JPID as a type on its own and not to combine it with like JHN.
I don't know if, and I guess that's the question, right? Like if someone's passing JPID, should they also be passing in JHN?
You don't always have both.
But I think you're saying typing it as both, right, Ken?
That's an open question for me.
Oh,
Is that the expectation that when you're passing in JPID as a type, that you're also passing in JHN, or are we considering it to be completely separate and distinct from any of the other existing identifier types?
Well, JPID and JHN are different because JPID could have a SIN in it, which is not a JHN.
So it's a superset.
are there cases where they would be, you would both have something that would be typed a singular value that would be typed as a JPID and a JHN?
No,
Well, we
not
have
by the way we define the naming systems.
we do have the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada health card number and interim federal health.
Yeah, we have more than one identifier. We send more than one identifier. but we have identifier of type Indigenous Affairs, and we have identifier of type JHN. They're not the same types.
I think there's one defined under the JHN for some of those too.
Okay, I'd have to dig into all of the JHN pieces, but depending on the, ideally, if we've defined the definitions correctly, they should be unique and stand alone as different identifier types, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to resolve the actual identifier value.
And yep, and that's fine. I just want to make sure that we've looked at that and that we can safely and confidently say that the JPIDs are unique as an identifier type, and that you don't need to pass any of the other existing types, because that's one of the issues that we're coming across with some of the older specs that Ontario's put together, is that we also found that, you know, in addition to using whatever we're using from the extensible types, we also need something from the base types as well.
Now, whether the data that we're getting back and forth is defined cleanly to make sure that those are identified, that's a whole nother question. But so for instance, the Canadian Armed Forces health card number is a JPID, right? But it's not a jurisdictional health number.
But I believe it's included in the JHN list.
Yeah, we have it under identify health card numbers issued that let them to be recognized as services.
I mean, really and truly, the whole point of the naming system, the definition, is to say what kind of identifier is this, so that you can look up what the identifier value is.
It depends, I guess, what you consider jurisdiction is, because the Veterans Affairs could be the jurisdiction over veterans, right?
Yeah, the definition of jurisdiction is the official power to make legal decisions and judgments.
So
Yeah.
from that perspective, those ones are jurisdiction numbers.
Yes, and so I think we're conflating the identifier type, which is the naming system, and what namespace identifier comes from, with what kind of identifier it is, right? Because we have a naming system, and then we have the type, which is JHN.
Yeah, and actually it looks like we don't have crossover, at least in what we've documented with
Yeah.
these. I'm just looking, but I don't see the crossover with JPID and JHN there.
Yes, so I think we've tried to keep those separate.
So
Fourth item under JPID, isn't that a health card number?
which one?
The fourth bullet under JPID.
No, that's not necessary. That's not a healthcare number necessarily.
The one above that.
Oh, fourth one.
Health card number. Indigenous and Northern Affairs health card number.
Well, what
Yeah.
I was gonna do is actually just look to see how it's typed. Okay, I'm
May
opening
not
up
be-
the RI registry.
May not have typed them consistently, but in principle, hopefully they're not overlapping.
Yeah, and that's fine. I just want to make sure that we make it clear to implementers that they only need to pass in JPID and not any other types when they do send one of those JPIDs.
So
Well, right now, at least in the baseline, we don't constrain that. We have some slices on JHN, but we don't constrain what they send for JPIDs and things, I don't believe, in the baseline.
So I was going to propose that we just, it's like use the type that is surfaced alongside the naming system, but I don't know, I don't actually know whether or not these have types associated with them in the naming system. Like this is a TN, is that coming from 203 in a V2? Maybe we should remove it if it doesn't have a type of JPID and just put the indication of the type it does have.
Yeah, TN is from 203.
Let me just pull up real quick. I just want to make sure. I'm just gonna see if these have the types associated with them. Okay. So does that mean, is it fair to propose that we say effectively utilize the type that is listed in the Canadian URI registry as the type that classifies what will be put forward in the instance? And correct this to remove these and indicate, at least for this one, that this would be a TN, if that is. Would there be anyone who'd be opposed to that? So this would be a change to kind of, maybe it was an update, I don't know if something's been changed since.
As a TN, do any of the current types apply as well?
Oh, so you're saying,
If this
the types
TN
are-
is also GHN,
definitionally or interpretation wise?
both, because we don't have the idea of hierarchy in O2 or 3. Sorry, yeah, we've just been going through a lot of these. Is this a subset or a superset, or is it a type of one of these types, and then have to deal with the extensibility issues? And it's giving us headaches. I want to make sure that we're also tackling that here and not having to deal with it after the fact.
So how would you
Yeah.
recommend we come to a conclusion around, like, is it, we're making a decision about?
I think so.
whether or
Yeah.
not- Okay. Lauren, you were saying something.
Yeah, no, I was just sort of echoing Ken's comments about the fact that as we're actually trying to get real about interactions with the identifiers, that we're hitting some of these issues.
This is, so hold on, let me actually just look at the modeling of this real quick. So, Ken, you initially said, do we make the statement that you should be one and not, that you should only have, like, you would expect that JHN would be a separate type from JPID, and that the naming systems in one would not overlap with the other. In the case where we talk about an overlap of TN and JHN, if that's the overlap that we're seeing, wouldn't someone just cover that by supplying multiple codings? And maybe we,
So you can't supply multiple codings and identifiers. You can supply multiple identifiers. But a given identifier is only of one type.
but it's a codable concept that can support multiple
No, it's
codings.
not. It's an identifier.
No, I'm sorry. Identifier type is a codable concept.
Right, exactly. And so that allows for multiple codings. And
Yes,
we're
that makes
obliged-
things really complicated.
and we're always obliged to send one of the ones from identifier type if available, if possible. So I guess it's kind of two separate issues. So setting aside the T and the tree number one, because that's maybe a reclassification issue. All I'm asking is for things that we're saying are JPIDs, are we confident that they're not one of the other existing identifier types? And if that's the case, I'm fine with that. Let's just make a statement simple that says, if you're passing JPID, you don't need to pass any of the other existing ones because it doesn't fall into one of those existing categories.
So this list here, that's what you want.
I'd love for that to be true.
Not so much even the categories, just the JPID as a category, that JPID is not a subset or partial intersect with JHNs or any of the other existing ones there. Can we go to just base fire identifier.type
Mhm.
value set?
Okay, so this is the identifier value, the identifier data type definition, and I'm gonna go to the type value set.
Yeah. And so, it's come to our attention that, the whole definition of extensible bindings is that you can use bindings that you need that maybe aren't fully covered under this list. Or if you are using your own, like you still have to use one of these if it's at a different granularity than what you want. I
Yeah,
think
that's true. If the concept matches, even if it's at a more more specific granularity, if the concept matches is here at a higher granularity, you have to use what's here.
yeah,
That's the definition of extensible binding. If
right.
there's, if what you have, the concept isn't in this list at all, then you can use your own.
And so I just want to make it clear that, if someone was to use JPIT, that they don't also have to pass on one of these ones. That's all I'm asking, and to make sure that's clear in the implementation guidance.
So what's our definition of JPIT? Does
I think we
JPIT map
proposed-
to any of these?
So one of the challenges here is that when we propose its addition as a request for change in the base fire specification, it was denied as a individual concept for addition. So I think we probably have to go back to what was the proposed definition for JPIT at that time, and whether or not its interpretation at that time was that it fell under JHN. I don't know if that makes a difference in, like, if the fire work groups that were in charge of managing this code system made an interpretation, if that would change how we would implement it. But I think that that context should be considered.
Well, it does change based on the fact that in the base spec it's an extensible binding. It does change things.
So does
Because-
it make sense to start our review at the next governance session with, okay, here was the ticket, here was the resolution, like, here's what they came back to us with, here was what we originally proposed as the definition, and given that, do we make guidance in the guide that explicitly says either this has crossover with JHN, and so use the JHN type, or use the JPID type as a distinct.
Well, so if we do have crossover, then we may end up in terms of the identifier.type within the codable concept of JHN, and then a translation in the codable concept to the JPID. But the trouble is that some of the things that we've identified in JPID are things like driver's license number and passport number, right?
SIN and resident card.
And
Wouldn't drivers be a DL data type or
That would
identifier
be.
type? Yeah.
it would be, yeah. So the question is, in terms of what we identified here in this list of JPIDs, do any of these things overlap with what's already in the value set? Or can we just use them because they have no overlap and it's extensible binding?
So I think, does it make sense to start the session with, okay, let's review this, let's review where it landed, and then actually look into, because right now, unless someone offers it sometime between our next meeting, I as far as I know, there is no other further definition beyond what was originally proposed to the fire base specification. So I think that will probably help us answer, was this correct?
Yes, I think looking at that ticket and the response to that ticket will provide input. I
Okay.
agree.
Okay. All right, well, I said I wouldn't jinx myself. So what I will say is we may have to hold off a little bit on our guidelines for use a little longer. What I would ask for homework is if folks ahead of our next session, like, I would like to start tackling some of these components, even if the identifier question continues to carry over into a number of other sessions. So my ask for you folks is to familiarize yourself with one of the, or at least read the extension definition for one of the mechanisms that when we started the guidelines for use, we didn't have available to us, but that we do have available to us now. So the next session, I'd like to carve out some time to talk through it and talk through how we could use it and talk about how we might want to put forward guidelines for use so that we can chew on that and determine, do we update our kind of recommended decision tree?
So when you say extension definition, are you talking about the way we backport R5 into R4, that kind of extension?
No,
definition?
it's a specific extension called impose profile that's supposed to support, conformance activities to allow for multi-inheritance. I put it in the chat,
Okay.
but
Yes, and so when is our next session?
it'll be, so the one on the 22nd will be profiling. So our next session will be September 29th for governance. Now we could tackle this discussion and the orientation in our next profiling to this extension, if that is more preferable to folks. Because it is a little bit more of a technical walkthrough and like discussion. Would anyone be opposed to that? That may allow us to kind of preserve a little bit more time on the governance for the identifier portion. Okay. If there are no folks that are thinking that doesn't quite make sense, they'll preliminarily schedule that as an initial walkthrough and discussion on the 22nd. We won't make any decisions, but we would like to try to at least raise it as a potential consideration for guidelines for use on the 29th, while we return to the other identifier topic. Okay, all right, thanks folks. Mike, if you can zip up the recording and add it to the YouTube channel, that would be great.
Awesome, will do. Sounds good.
Thanks, cheers.
Okay,
We'll see
take care.
you, some of you folks in a day or two.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Uh,